So here I am in the middle of an abandoned street. Nobody around. Traffic's quiet. And you know why? Because this is the celebration of the Maple Leafs winning the Stanley Cup, which never happens. Oh, look, a car. Oh, they just thought the Leafs made it past the Bruins. Yeah, since '67, the Leafs celebration has been like this. An empty road. So, let's give it up for the Leafs. Go Leafs, go! After all, they need some encouragement. We all need encouragement. Where would we be without the diehard Leaf fans like me? Encouraging every year. We all need encouragement. Let's be encouragers. It's what we'll talk about. It's why we gather. So we can encourage each other. Well, nothing happening here. No Stanley Cup in sight. I'm going for a ride.
Wherever the Apostle Paul went, it seems he left a bit of a firestorm behind him. Before his encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, he was creating chaos by persecuting the disciples of Jesus. His devout commitment to the historic religion of ancient Israel pushed him to bring down all those who, at least in his opinion, were corrupting it with this new teaching about Jesus being the Messiah. After his encounter with Christ, he continued to have the same kind of impact, just from the other perspective. Once convinced of the truth that Jesus is the Messiah, crucified and raised from the dead, he was equally passionate to share this good news with everyone. And in that process ignited the same kind of reactions in his former colleagues that once marked Paul's own agenda. Now he was the object of that hostility as he sought to share the gospel as broadly as possible. Paul visits the city of Thessalonica and, as was his habit, starts by visiting the local synagogue. Even though Paul was now converted to Christianity, he was still a Jewish rabbi, and he leveraged that opportunity to engage with the local Jewish community. According to Acts 17, Paul was in the synagogue engaging with people for 3 Sabbaths. Given that the synagogues back then typically had 3 gatherings a week, it's probable that Paul spoke 8 or 9 times, and evidently his message was clearly understood. It evoked a strong response from the local religious leaders, but not a positive one. They were quite irate at Paul's suggestion that Jesus was the resurrected Messiah. While a significant number of people did embrace this new teaching, the leaders of the synagogue were enraged and decided something needed to be done. They started sowing discontent among the people and found others in the marketplace who were inclined to help them start a riot. There was one guy in particular, sympathetic to the gospel, whose name was Jason. Evidently, he offered hospitality to Paul and unwittingly became the epicenter for the riot. The Jewish leaders crashed his house, and because they couldn't find Paul, they dragged poor Jason and the others before the local Roman magistrates. Conveniently forgetting the facts, these religious leaders tell the magistrates that Jason and his colleagues, along with his friends Paul and others, were seeking to overthrow the Roman Empire. They accused Jason and the others of being loyal to a king other than the emperor. Yeah, like they themselves, as members of Judaism, were loyal to the Roman king. But this king's name was Jesus, and these men were there to support this new king and solicit support from others. Surely the Roman magistrates would want to put a stop to this. Evidently, there wasn't enough evidence to toss them in jail, but to keep the peace, the magistrates required Jason and the others post a peace bond, and then he released them. Obviously, the community of faith was concerned for the well-being of Paul, so they sent Paul and his friends out of town as soon as it was safe to do so. But for those who lived in Thessalonica, they had no choice but to stay and continue their daily lives. Yet everything had changed. They had a clearer understanding of the gospel. They were emboldened by Paul. They continued to share the good news of the risen Messiah, but they also continued to be the objects of scorn and persecution by the old-school religious leaders. While Paul moves on to other cities, often receiving the same treatment, he does not forget his friends left behind in Thessalonica. He prays for them, and he writes them a couple of letters to encourage them. Encouragement. It is as essential to our well-being as food and water. And it is one of the key reasons why we gather. Yeah, we can encourage with a Hallmark card, a text message, a phone call, and Zoom. Our technology provides a myriad of opportunities to share information with one another. But you can't beat, and we all need, as we're discovering right now, personal, intimate, face-to-face contact with people. Encouragement happens in the world of relationships. Technology can reinforce that, but it will never displace personal contact. God created us to be social beings. As Paul ends his first letter back to this church in Thessalonica, he writes these words, 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 11 to 14. Therefore, encourage one another and build up each other, just as you are in fact doing. Now we ask you, brothers and sisters, to acknowledge those who labor among you and preside over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them most highly in love because of their work. Be at peace amongst yourselves. And we urge you, brothers and sisters, admonish the undisciplined, comfort the discouraged, help the weak, and be patient toward all. We all need encouraging words. Paul's focus, though, is broader than just sharing uplifting phrases. Please don't misunderstand. That is a significant part of gathering to encourage. The community of faith, though, is a place of shared trust, primarily in God, but also in our support of one another. And Paul doesn't want to simply encourage, he wants to enable the church to be a community of encouragers. So what does that look like? What are the qualities of being an encourager? Encouragers support each other. Notice verse 11. It may seem redundant, starting with encourage one another and just as you are doing. There was a good thing happening in this church. But even good things need nurture. They need to be reinforced. They were caring for each other, and they needed to continue that habit. Underlying this instruction of encouraging is a sense of mutual support and strengthening, not just as a group activity, but one-on-one. Implicit is the idea of trust, intimacy, and sharing burdens. The word picture Paul uses refers to the construction of any structure. Any given component of a building, say a house, will function only as it's incorporated into the whole of the building and sometimes functions best when it's under a load. 2x4s in a wall won't support drywall or maintain their position and shape if a few nails aren't driven into them. Floor joists won't take the weight unless they are properly spaced. And no one floor joist can support the entire house. All the diverse parts need to be tied together. They all support each other. No one is a hero. No one is the super Christian. Mutual interdependence, walking together, and being honest with each other is foundational to being an encourager. It doesn't help to have all the answers. It does help to stagger through life together. We each know pieces of the puzzle that can help others, but none of us know it all. Supporting each other means we acknowledge our own vulnerabilities. It means living humbly. Having a few trusting and intimate friendships are probably the best way to ensure humility. There's always someone out there who knows the real truth and can call our attention to any pretense. Encouragers also promote unity. Verse 13 ends with, "Be at peace amongst yourselves." This doesn't mean avoid conflict at all cost. Peace in the Jewish culture was the presence of healthy relationships, not the absence of conflict. Sometimes healthy relationships demand courage to point out when something is not right. It's a risk. It's hard to do. But if we are committed to being encouragers of one another together, then we will have to have the courage to promote peace, godly behaviors and relationships against divisions and sin. Let's be honest. We all sin. We all need that trusting, loving person to help us work through it. Paul is not suggesting we stand up in some kind of group confession or that we wink at wrong kinds of patterns of behavior. He's clear about this in other letters he has written. He is stressing, though, that it is necessary. There's a necessity to protect that which the Spirit of God has already done for us. Unite us in Christ as his body. And that's why we gather. To physically experience what has happened spiritually. Being peaceful means we share in the commitment of guarding and protecting and promoting the integrity of the body, even when it is us who is in the wrong. An example of this is Paul's own life in Acts 15. After seeing all the amazing things God was doing in the early church and the ministry of Paul and others, there was suddenly a strong difference in opinion. Take a moment this week and read Acts 15. To make a long story short, Paul ends up taking a new partner with him in his travels and sets out to preach the gospel again. But what intrigues me is that nowhere in this story does Luke say they did anything wrong. There was room for diversity of opinions and styles of ministry, as long as it was not about the integrity of the gospel. But earlier in chapter 15, that had been exactly the issue. In the first part of Acts 15, there were two issues, two moments of conflict. There was a division over the nature of the gospel and of God's grace and how we obtained our salvation. In the first instance, they were bold and they set the record straight. There could be no compromise on salvation by grace alone. In the second issue, the one of ministry partnership, they just adopted an alternative ministry. And there was peace. Finally, encouragers are caregivers. This is the message of verse 14. Evidently, some in that church needed to be stimulated to engage more. Others needed the comfort to overcome discouragement, and the weak needed to be uplifted. All of us fit into any one of those profiles from time to time, so Paul adds this final sprinkling of grace, and be patient with everyone. All these are important, but the instruction in verse 14 that jumps out to me the most is help the weak. Literally, those who are without strength. There's no point in trying to figure out exactly what kind of weakness Paul has in mind here. I think it's broad, physical, emotional, spiritual. It doesn't matter. Around us, and from time to time, we ourselves are exhausted, overwhelmed, and we don't need to be told to do better, or to suck it up, buttercup, or to get it together. That's not helpful. No, we need to be gently supported, refreshed, and to move forward with the rest of the community, not to be left behind. In our Western culture, we place great emphasis on individualism, but the church was birthed in an era where group identity, whether that was ethnic, national, religious, or social, was just as important, if not more important, than the individual identity. We gather together because the best path forward, the best way to mature our faith, is to do so in the context of other Jesus followers. All these instructions Paul is giving are addressed to the group, to the dynamic of the whole body. These are not personal one-on-one life hacks. There's little doubt that the pressure that was exerted on this community of faith because of Paul continued long after he left. There's some evidence to suggest it even increased. I imagine Paul's heart was heavy as he fondly remembered the time with his friends and considered how his own ministry had contributed to their current suffering. But that's life in the kingdom. Bottom line, we gather because we need each other in order to grow our faith. Following Jesus is a team event, not one of individual achievements. And none of us can do it all. None of us can do it alone. We gather because we need each other. It is the greatest physical reminder of this spiritual truth. We are one in Christ. Encouragement is so critical to our faith. Not faith in the sense that it's part of our relationship with God to make us holy or to save us, but our faith is integrated into every dimension of our life. There is no separation. Life is about faith, and life can be hard. So we need to encourage one another. Sometimes it's very easy to be the encourager and much more difficult to be the encouragee. That requires some vulnerability, some transparency, some authenticity, and we find it hard sometimes to trust one another. But that's why we gather, so we can know each other, so we can hear each other's stories, so we can discover the good things that God is doing by His grace in one another. And as we learn those things, as we build relationship, as we build trust with one another, then we can encourage each other. And there is something irresistible about a healthy community of faith where that trust, not the clique and unique, us for no more kind of mentality, but an open, embracing kind of a trust exists. People can see that right away. And I think at Q50 we've got that. Now we need to nurture that, to grow that, and continue to use that for God's glory. Find someone today to encourage. If you didn't read the Friday note, please go back and read that, because we have an opportunity to encourage Will in St. Peter's Hospital. Let's take advantage of that. So whatever your day may bring today, remember this: worship God and wash your hands.